All right, we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the East Bay Regional Park District Board Executive Committee. Today is Tuesday, November 9th, 2021, and it is 12:34. And Becky, can you take the roll call, please?
Yes, President Rosario,
Here.
Director Corbett,
Here.
Director Coffey,
Here.
okay, and Park District staff participating in this meeting include GM Landreth, DGM Anna Alvarez, AGM Christina Kochner, Chief Brian Holt, AGM Jim O'Connor, Chief Lisa Gorgian, Police Chief Anthony Cheerborough, Chief Ann Passabon, Mike Moran, and Lisa Baldinger, and Brenda Montano, and Eric Bueller. In this meeting, we also have Director Beverly Lane and Director Elizabeth Eccles attending as members of the public. Today's meeting is held pursuant to the Brown Act as amended by AB 361. Board members and staff may participate via phone and video conferencing. This meeting is a hybrid of an in-person attendance with board members, designated staff, and members of the public. We are providing live audio and video streaming. For members of the public not attending in person, public comments may be submitted live via Zoom, via email, or via voicemail as noted on the agenda. If there are no questions about meeting procedures, we will begin.
Thank you very much. And so we have our, going to be reviewing our district naming policy. So we'll turn it over to Chief Holt.
My video here. Hopefully you're able to hear me. Director Coffey, you're the one person I see on camera. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're able to hear me all right? Are folks able to hear me? Yes, okay, great, thank you. You're the one person who's not hearing me. So good afternoon, Brian Holt, Chief of Planning, Trails, and GIS. It's a pleasure to be here with you in person. I think this is actually my first in-person board committee or board meeting, so this is a pleasure. With that, we're gonna just have a conversation today about our naming policy, and going to review our existing naming policy and just some things to consider as we move forward. So with that, Sabrina Pinnell, I believe, is going to be showing some slides. So if you could go ahead and put those up. Thank you, Sabrina. So yeah, what we're going to be discussing today is the toponymy of the East Bay Regional Park District. So I've learned a new term through this process, and that is toponymy, which is the study of place names of a region, and the meaning and the language behind it. So we're all going to become toponymous today. We got a picture here. I just thought this was interesting. Martin Luther King Jr. Regional Shoreline. So an example of one of our park sets named for a historic figure, and then Arrowhead Marsh, which is a natural feature, which is named for the shape of the marsh there. So that's Sabrina, you can go to the next slide. So part of what we want to discuss today is why names matter. And I think it's interesting. It's, we use place names hundreds, if not thousands of times a day. And I don't think we necessarily often stop to think about where those names originated from, what they convey, and really the stories that they tell. So for our parklands, names really do matter. They establish the interpretive narrative of a park. Actually, I'll share Eddie Willis, who's a planner in our department, but has been a long time interpreter of Black Diamond Mines, kind of conveyed over his sort of thought that a park name should, with any interpreter, to be able to bring a group of school kids into a park and really do a full interpretive program based on the name of the park. The sort of significance. Park names have the opportunity to educate our park users and others on history, flora, fauna, or the geology of the park. Clearly, names recognize historic geographic names that have been associated with the place. They provide geographic orientation, certainly East Shore State Park, now McLaughlin, East Shore State Park. You know where you are at East Shore. Increasingly recognizing the need to honor Indigenous history and the importance of highlighting untold stories on the land. We saw a lot of interest in that through a recent Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, one of the Porch Probably 50. Parks names can acknowledge the family history, who's owned and lived on the land prior to Park District acquisition. An opportunity to honor individual contributions, and really all of this sort of contributes to the tokenomic equity of a place. So, how equitable is the naming program in terms of who it represents, and we'll go into that a little more. So next slide, Sabrina. So just a quick review of the sort of points of our 2004 naming policy, and I think it's worth taking a look at since we're 16, 17 years down the road of this naming policy. It basically says regional parks, trails, features, areas, and facilities will be named after natural features or for cultural features. Specifies that naming and recognition of persons living or deceased may be allowed only in special cases, and states that the district's preference is to express appreciation for individuals' contributions through awards, events, tributes, publicity, commemorative items, and mementos. And then our naming policy comes with a bit more detailed administrative naming guidelines that further describes the process and the criteria for naming consideration. So then the next slide. So staff, we kind of dove into this actually before some of our recent naming conversations came up. Just sort of dove in and took a look at all of our named facilities, trying to understand what's the ecosystem of our existing naming program. So we have a database of about 1,680 named features. These are parks, but also our trails, visitor centers, picnic areas, staging areas, and other facilities. The vast majority of those are named after geographic features. And then plants, animals, and then coming forth is from people. And 47 of those people names are named after Park District staff or board members. So next slide, Sabrina. So looking at just our whole park names, you can see pretty close, evenly split between geographic and person names. So we have 18 parks that are named for people. And these are really named for individuals and perhaps not the historic sort of ranching name that's associated with it. Next slide. So as we talk about sort of equity and how are those names distributed, and we sort of look at what percentage of those names are for men versus women. This has come up in previous conversations. 90% of our named facilities are for men, 10% for female. Next slide. And then as we go into our full park names, we've got 18 parks named for people. 14 of those are for male, 3 for female. And then we have one couple, the Kevin and Kathy Radke Martinez Shoreline. And then we have 2 parks that are named for just one person, Anthony Chabot and the Lake Chabot. So just interesting. If you can go back to Sabrina, if you could go back one second. Yeah, so just stopping here. So we wanted to just get a snapshot of kind of the demographic distribution. We didn't dive into, say, the other demographics that we could look at, so racial distribution or others. I think it's probably pretty evident sort of where those would break down, as we have the preponderance of names for white male, white female. So, next slide. Looking at our administrative guidelines, this is sort of what guides us as staff in the naming process. So So naming can be done as part of a park planning process. So this is as we're developing a land use plan for a new park or some other sort of plan, we often engage in a naming exercise associated with that. So we did that in naming what was then named the Gateway Regional Shoreline, which is now named the Judge John Sutter Regional Shoreline. And then also through the adoption of the Thurgood Marshall Regional Park from the Course of 50. So those are two examples of where it's sort of named through the park planning process. Or it can be done on a case-by-case basis at the request of the board or general manager. And that's where a lot of our naming requests have come from. The naming proposals could really be made by anyone. We do occasionally receive requests from the public to suggest names. And so that's written into the policy as well. And then the recommended process is that a name suggestion, a name request is reviewed by the executive committee. And then it's brought to the park advisory committee for input or possible recommendation. And then that's brought back to the executive committee for the final recommendation to the full board of directors, who makes the final decision. And just the overall policy in there is that the board can interpret this policy flexibly and ultimately has final authority. So just I guess a quick story on the Judge John Sutter Regional Shoreline. When the Park District became engaged in the naming conversations for that park, the Bay Area Toll Authority, who was the lead agency in developing the master plan for that park, they had actually brought in an outside consultant to do some branding. And I think they generated a list of 300 names, possible names for that park. They whittled that down to 50. There were a lot of, Bridgeview Regional Park and, Bay Shoreline Regional Park. We brought those names to the PAC and actually engaged in a bit of a naming exercise where you can sort of see some of the notes there where the PAC recommended some of the things that popped out for them. Ultimately, the PAC did recommend that it should be named to a recognized person, and that's when we brought it back to the executive committee. And the executive committee really recommended that for a person it should be Judge John Sutter. So that was kind of the journey that we went through on the Judge John Sutter shoreline. So next slide, Selena. So taking a look at some of our recently adopted names. We have the Dotson Family Marsh on Panola Regional Shoreline, named in honor of Whitney Dotson and his family. The Ted and Kathy Radke Martinez Regional Shoreline. As I just mentioned, the Judge John Sutter Regional Shoreline. Our recently request to the state to name the Doug Simon Visitor Center at Proud Cove. There's the Carol Severin Short Route Trail located in Gary. And I should have on here the Dr. Aurelia Reinhardt Regional Park. The Dunbar and Quarry Campground on the Bay, and then of course our recently named Thurgood Marshall Regional Park under the Port Chicago 50s. So, and I would be remiss here if I didn't, mention for my GIS folks and public affairs folks. So, as the names get longer, it gets more challenging for them to put names on a map. But it's also important to think about sort of how we shorten names as well. So, we did name the Dr. Aurelia Reinhardt Redwood Regional Park, which is a long name. And that's been shortened to Reinhardt Redwood Regional Park, to which, I've received comments from folks that, sort of taking away the Aurelia part of that name really kind of takes away some of the honor of her as a woman, and then taking away the doctor, and really takes away that recognition that she was, a remarkable person and that she was a doctor. And the president of Mills College in the age that she was when females generally didn't necessarily achieve that level of education. So the names get longer, but there's sort of, there's a reason for that as well. So we have to be thoughtful of sort of how we shorten and abbreviate names as well. I would say the same with Ted and Kathy Radke Martinez Regional Shoreline, as that's been shortened to Radke Martinez Regional Shoreline. I think it's really important as we tell that story that we continue to tell the story of Kathy Radke as well as Ted Radke as we interpret the name of the park. Next slide, Sabrina. So we received a number of recent naming requests. There's been suggestions for Lonnie Hancock, Judy Banks, who is with the Metropolitan Horsemen's Association, and of course, former General Manager Pat O'Brien. We did receive a request from the City of Berkeley City Council regarding Volmer Peak, which is kind of a whole separate process that the Park District doesn't necessarily have a lot of control over. Recently received requests at the Chenard to recognize the Chenard family at the Chenard Winery, and then Jack Roddy at Roddy Ranch or Deer Valley. Next slide. And so just, I want to mention we've got a lot of future parks that we're working on that, have what I would call working names. And I'm not suggesting that any names need to be changed, but these aren't necessarily formally adopted names by the board or anybody else that we're going to be going into planning processes for where these questions will come up. So Albany Point, where we have right now the Northwest Territories Regional Shoreline. Doolin Canyon, which is for a previous property owner, the Doolin family. Clayton Ranch. Clayton Ranch is a failed subdivision, so it continues to be named on there. Deer Valley, which Deer Valley Regional Preserve actually consists of now 3 different valleys: Horse Valley, Deer Valley, and Deer Valley. As I mentioned, the Roddy Ranch Golf Course, Chenard Winery in the future staging area at that site, the Delta Access, Nunn property, and then the Basket Hills area. So we will have naming decisions continuing to come forward. Next slide. So we did take a look at what others are doing. I did reach out to colleagues through the National Recreation and Parks Association. Also reached out to professors at the Futures Histories Laboratory at UC Berkeley, and others in the Planning and History departments at UC Berkeley, and just dove into a number of other agencies' policies, other cities' policies, and I'll just say there is no real established best practices. It's kind of amazing to me that there's so little written on the sort of art of toponymy, and it's really all over the place between some very cumbersome processes to others that are pretty minor. But I will say there's an increasing recognition for the need to consider equity and inclusion as we are developing place names and the stories that those place names tell. I will just say as staff and others, I think there's an interest in sort of re-examining how we engage with the community in our names. So what input are we getting from everybody that we should be getting input from? I think certainly a lesson learned from the Thurgood Marshall Regional Park is making sure that we're doing very proactive community engagement and reaching out to the communities that we know and understand would be interested and concerned, rather than expecting them to just come to us. And I'll just share, Lisa Gorgian, our Chief of Design and Construction, has kind of shared some of her thoughts on the sort of, a lot of folks who engage in this practice of naming, there might be older folks who are kind of looking to the past to honor history, and sort of what's the role of the youth in terms of looking to the future, something to consider there. Each agency has a varying approach to naming for people, particularly living people. I heard from a lot of folks who just don't name things after people in general. Other policies are very specific in that they don't name facilities for people who are still living. And then there's agencies who use it as an opportunity to honor those who are living. And then varying levels of process. Like I said, some very cumbersome, and then some that are pretty loose. So it's difficult to really say that there's sort of one standard best practice out there. So next slide, Sabrina. So looking at just some recent examples of what have been done kind of in our region, in our space, the city of Berkeley the city manager initiated a public process to rename 2 blocks of Shattuck Avenue. And they initiated this by really kind of an open-ended, asking the community to make suggestions through public meetings. They did a lot of youth targeted outreach. There was a lot of social media push. There was polling. I think they had at one point a wall on Shattuck Avenue that folks could just come by and make suggestions there. And then they took a step to form a full naming advisory committee, which consisted of historians from UC Berkeley, the Berkeley Chamber of Commerce, other business owners around Shattuck, and just a number of folks who were interested in that. So formed a whole separate committee on the naming for this. Recommendations were then brought to the City Council subcommittee. I think it was their essentially a public works subcommittee who reviewed the final naming recommendations. And ultimately, what they landed on and named the section of Shattuck Avenue Calabagai Way. Calabagai was an immigrant from India who relocated to Berkeley and actually found it difficult to find housing in Berkeley because of the redlining that was happening in the community at that time. But she went on to be sort of a civil rights activist and was really active in the immigrant community in Berkeley. This name was suggested there, and just having witnessed the process, similar, I think, to our Thurgood Marshall naming process, is just the awareness of who Calabagai was and the history of Indian Americans in the city of Berkeley. It just brought a lot of awareness and conversation around that. So there was just some education that just happened through the process in general. Next slide, please. City of Albany, City of Alameda. My counterpart, Amy Woolridge, has been working through this at the city kind of simultaneously as we've been having these conversations. So in February of 2021, the City Council there directed an updated policy. And some of this came about requests for the city to rename what was Jackson Park, to change the name from Andrew Jackson Park to something else, which eventually became Chichenga Park. In September of 2021, they went to the Historic Advisory Board, Planning Board, and the Recreation Parks Commission. Their policy carries forward a policy that was already in place, which requires that a person that a person be deceased for at least 3 years to be considered for a facility or a street name. It includes a goal of policy in there that specifies that names should intentionally broaden the representation of people in Alameda. And it is a pretty thorough process. It increases public participation through a 4-step process with input through their Historic Advisory Board, Planning Board, Parks Board, and then ultimately approval by the City Council. And then it created a formal application process for renaming facilities. And this was adopted just last month on October 19th. Next slide, Sabrina. And then, of course, state parks also having this conversation. They initiated a re-examining our past initiative. Fortunately, I don't necessarily think that this is a problem the Park District has, but just that there's some, blatantly offensive names in the state park system that they need to take a look at. They initiated this process in 2020, evaluating existing park and facility names. And one of the things that Wade Crowfoot went and did was specifically expanded representation on the California Advisory Committee on Geographic Names. So a relatively obscure advisory committee that specifically acknowledged that there needed to be some folks, people of color, Latinx, and other folks represented on that advisory committee. And then one of the first actions that they've done, which was announced recently, is renamed what was known as Patrick's Point State Park, which they reinstated the name that was historically always in place in the New York name of Suman State Park in Albany County. So next slide, Sabrina. So just some of the things that I think we could consider as we're approaching naming, again, is really just what are the stories that we wish to tell in our parks, and how do the names that we select for our parks influence or impact those stories. And the role that our parks play in educating the public on our region's history. I think we should consider the representation of historically marginalized people in outdoor spaces. I think some of the most powerful arguments that we heard with the Marshall Regional Park naming was really hearing from people how representation does matter, and having spaces that specifically are welcoming to people who have not seen themselves in the parks in the past is really impactful for those communities. Just how do we engage the community in naming considerations, the sort of outreach that we do. And then considering the role of staff, PAC members, historians, others in generating naming recommendations. And ultimately the goal that I'm sure we all share is to maintain an inclusive process as we move forward. Next slide, please. So for staff, some of our next steps, like I say, we're here not necessarily to recommend that we revise the naming policy or specific actions that need to be taken. And we want to have a conversation around this. We want to review our existing process. I feel it's important that we establish an interdepartmental sort of staff advisory committee to review these main proposals, as well as some of our archive and interpretation proposals. So working with public affairs, government affairs, interpretation, and others to review these, to review such recommendations. Diving in and evaluating our naming policy, our administrative guidelines, developing some community outreach strategies and goals for each naming process as they come up. Clarifying the role of staff and historians and others in generating naming recommendations. And then we've heard from the PAC their interest in being involved, so looking at how we involve, or we will involve the PAC as we continue to have this conversation. And then I suggest that we come back and return to the board, to the executive committee with specific input recommendations and suggested edits. So with that, that's my presentation, and I'm happy to have a conversation and answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to start with questions from the board. I'm going to see Director Corbett. We'll give you first shot since I can't see you. Do you have any questions or comments?
I really appreciate the presentation and some of the history of what we've seen and done, but I honestly think that we should have more discussion as a board on how we play a leading role as the elected officials, who represent the community, and have more of an opportunity to discuss the history of naming in the past, and then develop the policy as it should be, because we really haven't discussed that as a board for years. And some of us who are newer, we're not that new anymore, but who are newer, we're not part of discussions that happened before we got there. But in any event, I really think there should be more discussions as a board about the history, what our roles should be, what the goals should be, and, just have an opportunity to have some discussions. I don't know if we would do that as a committee or how we would do it, but I really think more of that needs to be done. And I just like to have more of that before we make a final decision, because it is important, the decisions that are made. And I do think the electeds really have the most important role in sort of leading that decision-making process. So I think there's just more discussion we should have. And that's all I have to say for now.
Directors, I think you were still on mute. So.
Director Coffey?
I read your lips under your mask. I've learned to do that. Couple of questions. My interest in the issue and where I want to drill down a little is with the role of the PAC, obviously from my own 13-year experience there and having dealt with naming issues over the course of that tenure on the PAC and some of the issues that have arisen over the role of the PAC. So my first question, Brian, is I read the 2004 policy and I was focused on that role of the PAC, and it seems that, let me see if I have this right, that the naming issues and the potential names for a given item tend to come from management and go to the executive committee, this committee, and then are sent to the PAC with this committee's input or thoughts, and then the PAC either agrees with those suggestions or doesn't. If they don't, it comes back to the executive committee and then goes to the board of directors. Is that loosely how the process is supposed to work in terms of the PAC's role?
Yeah, I would say loosely, I would agree with you. I think my experience with the naming policy has been just really the sort of line that the board of directors and management have, can interpret the policy flexibly has been kind of the guiding sort of policy in there. So it's taken different approaches. I would say there's been times where we've just gone to the PAC with really a blank slate and sort of said, hey, we have a new park. What should we name it? And that's when we kind of can engage in some, creative conversations, those things. And then there's also those situations where, whether it's from the board or management, a request to name something after, the person or something else, where it's not as open-ended. But the plan is that, usually it goes to the executive committee for some initial discussion. We bring that to the PAC and inform them, what the request is, the input that we received from the executive committee, and then also taking the PAC input. And then we bring that back to the executive committee. If the PAC and the executive committee agree, then it's sort of on to the board of directors. Otherwise, we bring it back and say, this is what we heard from the PAC, and the executive committee has the authority to take that in and then make their decision. So that's been generally how it's been handled in the past.
Then I'm correct in observing that maybe we don't precisely follow that process in the policy of bringing things to the exec and then going to the PAC and then back to exec or back to the full board. We'll use the PAC at times as a sounding board earlier in the process, perhaps. Is that what you're saying?
That would be correct in that the policy hasn't, or the process hasn't been super rigid.
Which is fine. And then to bring it into the context of the PAC and issues that have arisen, I am unclear as to what we were being told by the PAC in relation to the process by which we just approved the Doug Seiden Visitor Center, Crab Cove name. And Rick Rickard isn't here. I just did a quick look through the participants. So my impression was that there was some question among the PAC. They received this name. I don't recall it going through exec, but maybe at some point it went through exec. But they were hearing this name and asked to give their input. And what I heard at our meeting where we approved that name to honor Doug Seiden was that there was some questioning either about the process or the idea of naming this particular item after someone who's still alive. And I'm wondering if someone who was closer to the PAC deliberations on that. I also read the minutes of the PAC meeting that we were given, and I still remained a little unclear, but I think the issue was among some of that membership, whether it was appropriate to name something after someone is alive. Was that the issue there, or was there a problem with the process? I mean, Eric might be close to
I'm
it.
going to take sort of the first stab, and then maybe Eric can jump in. My impression was, and I'm not necessarily going to speak to the concerns of the full PAC per se, whether it was concern about naming for a person or whatever. I think it was more about the role of the PAC and the input that they provide, and that we were bringing forward a name to them that was, essentially decided by the board. And so there wasn't necessarily a lot of opportunity for PAC input. We have heard in the past from the PAC in past naming exercises, concerns about the equity of our names, with regards to, like I said, female versus male names. So we anticipated that might be a question or a concern that the PAC would have. And we've known that they had interest in engaging in those. So I think that was where some of the concerns were. In terms of the actual direction that the PAC did, if Eric wants to jump on and sort of speak to that.
Yeah, Director Coffey, I think primarily, and can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think primarily the PAC was seeking clarification of the naming policy and their role, and they really wanted a moratorium on naming any new facilities until the overall policy had been reviewed by the board. So that was the primary focus of their discussion. I believe there was one or two, in fact, I'm working on the minutes again right now, and I believe there were one or two members that mentioned the living person, but it was more just understanding the actual policy and their role, and wanting to have a moratorium until it had been reviewed and that they had some input in that review process.
Okay, and then I'll conclude with a comment, and I don't have the answer at this point, but I guess that's why this is being discussed. My own experience with the PAC and some of the naming issues that the body worked on while I was there, and the more recent experience I've had from the perspective of a board member, is there at times repeatedly exists a tension with the PAC and their role. And I suspect that's what was involved with the Doug Seiden naming. And I know of examples where that tension has arisen and existed in the past. And it is with the idea that the board of directors and management often come into the process by which a naming is a naming of an item, big or small, is initiated, and come into the process with a favorite name, or there is a kind of existing understanding institutionally within the Park District leadership, be it primarily among board members, be it primarily among management, that there's a presumptively good name that we have in mind for this item, and it then gets put out there for this process, and a tension arises because if it is sent to the PAC with the understanding that there is already a favorite name within the organization up to the board level, then they ask themselves, well, what's really our role here? right? You know, and I remember having that feeling and on certain occasions. Well, wait a minute, this is a given. This is going to be the name. Are we really to have a blank slate and start thinking of our own names? Or are we supposed to be pursuing what other community leaders think? What is the role of the PAC in that instance? And I usually just took the position or talked to my board member, in that case, Ted Radke, and you know, what is the name you folks are looking for here, and what is our role and the feedback here? Is it just a good idea or a bad idea, or are we supposed to look for our own names? And management, when you present to the PAC, often really feel that, and so that we won't tell the PAC necessarily that there is an institutional favorite here. And I'll be real frank. From the moment I was appointed to the board of directors, I always assumed that park was going to be named after John Sutter. It was to me, it was a given from years of being involved in the park district. And so, maybe when some naming like that one gets to the BAC, and we don't admit as we present it that, yeah, there's a favorite here. There's a name institutionally that we think is appropriate for this park. Then what really is their role? And maybe when that kind of institutional thinking exists, we should be transparent about it, as opposed to being concerned about not putting this to them as a done deal, because that's the tension. Are we presenting this as a done deal, or are we presenting this as something where their input is needed afresh? And so, as I started out saying, I don't know the answer to that. I'm just identifying the tension that arises, and I tend to lean in the side of, if there is a predominant thought within the organization's leadership that there's an appropriate name for this particular park, for instance, with the Sutter example, that maybe we just should be transparent about it with the community, and especially the PAC, from the beginning. That's my thought, President Rosario.
Good insight. Thank you. And then for me, I think we've got the recent examples we have are show a diverse way of getting names into parks, especially with, and I think we learned a lot of, especially with Gilbert Marshall and Judge John Sutter, and those names, and that the community is really has a say and wants to say. And so no matter going forward, we should definitely make sure that we engage the community in those decisions. And my biggest thing is, part of the process is, once a name is proposed, where does it go? And who and is there a timeline? Is there once it's set in process, because a lot of times these names get proposed and then it's in limbo for a while and we don't know. So I'd like to see a process where at the beginning of the process, where a name is put forward, it goes to a particular department or person, and then and there's follow-up within a certain amount of time. Give the board a heads up where are we on that status? And do we have, should we, well, we shouldn't put a timeline on it, because sometimes outreach takes more time than we think, but I would think like within a year, we would know the status of the naming process of a particular piece of property or as it may be. But that's, other than that, I think the process, I mean, we engaged in several different processes, and definitely the Thurgood Marshall process was the best. It was very effective. And also, I'd like to stress too, and very encouraged by staff support about being inclusive and equity involved. And I really think we should be looking at our indigenous cultures, and having a lot of our parks be considered for that, to honor those first families. But I'm encouraged by the discussion. I'm sure this could be the first of many, I'm sure. But I appreciate bringing it to the executive committee, and I appreciate the research. And it is eye-opening to see that how women are really underrepresented, but that's in the culture in the park district that we have to overcome as well. And so I'm glad we're in that process of turning that around as well. So let's see. I think that was my only questions, and yeah, as long as we as the park district are open to honest conversations with the community that are going to be involved, and as we saw with David Marshall, I think we'll be good. And I sat in on that PAC meeting for Doug Seiden, and it was unanimous amongst all of them that Doug Seiden was clearly of that. But they wanted clarification as to their piece process.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, President Rosario. I just wanted to follow up on a few things that the board raised and just acknowledge them because on the record, because they're very consistent with a lot of the discussion that I think we'll continue to have. And I appreciate the note about this is maybe one of the first of many. This is a lot of policy questions, I think, that come up around this, but good policy questions. So, and first off, I want to say thank you to Brian and the staff for the staff report. I think it was very educational and helpful, and again, just a kickoff for all of us here. To Director Corbett's point about the board's role, absolutely. Ultimately, these are decisions of the board, both on the naming policy, but then also obviously making the decision itself on particular names. So I think at Brian's presentation, he mentioned that we would be coming back to the executive committee, whether or not you want to then bring it to the full board for further discussion, certainly up to you all. But I definitely see this as an ongoing conversation that we'd be having with you all on what you want to do with this. And then to Colin's point about the PAC's role, which I actually think we can broaden that to your point, Director Rosario, around community and community input and process, and what does that all look like? And is it real or not? And are we being honest with community when we bring them something? If it's been essentially pre-baked, then we need to be transparent about that. And it's okay. It's okay. If that's what the board has, already said the direction they want to go in, then let's be respectful of those community voices and being transparent about that. Totally agree with you around the timeline and the process. And really, again, that goes back to just transparency. And so that things don't just get put out there and no one really owns it, and we don't really know what to do with it until someone brings it back up again. So certainly that'll be part of what we'll be discussing that with the administrative guidelines, but ultimately bringing back to the executive committee and the board to weigh in on. So really appreciate the staff work and the board's input on all of this.
Any other comments from the board? Director Corbett, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add. I'm happy to hear what the general manager just said. I definitely think we really need to have more discussion about how the process works and, what are the best policies we should develop to make sure we, make the right decisions when, naming our parks. Obviously, we should name more parks for women. People have mentioned that. And, we should look at, just some of the other things everybody has raised to make sure that we make good decisions. But I'm looking forward that we have more discussion on how we do it the right way, but also discuss the best way to have, and maybe develop our naming process a little more than we have done. I think that would be good as well. So we have a little ways to go, I think.
Good coffee.
Nothing further, sir.
Great, thank you. I think at this point, I see this as an ongoing discussion. And I'm sure that the rest of the board would like to have some input as well. I was wondering, would that be best brought forward to a full board meeting, or should we wait for a workshop in the future?
We could think about bringing it to part of your workshop if you have one in the beginning of the year. I know we're talking about trying to get one in for December, but I don't think we can do that. But we could talk about scheduling that as part of our beginning of the year.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I could add, what I like about the workshop format is it facilitates PAC members who would like to attend and really participate in a dialogue rather than a presentation and discussion. It would be important. I think we'd get a lot of PAC member participation in the workshop format.
Well, so let's bring it forward to a future workshop, and then we'll consider this a live document, and we will proceed with the things that we brought up. Those considerations, then we can go forward. So work in progress. So thank you very much. Very good presentation. Thank you. Anything else? Any public comments?
Director Rosario, I have no request to speak today, but I do see I see Director Lane and Director Eccles attending as members of the public. So if you would like to speak, please unmute yourself.
No need to speak. I'm just here as an observer. Thank you. Great presentation.
We're not supposed to speak in this setting. So.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is the thought, Mr. Chair, that we'll set up a meeting for the entire board to have a discussion about the naming process?
Yes. We brought the workshop format.
And is that what we were talking about possibly doing in January? Is that what the general managers were speaking to? Okay, good. That sounds good. Thank you. Everybody should have their chance to put in their thoughts.
Yes, definitely. Very important. Yeah, we're gonna have quite a few workshops next year. President Coffee.
He's retired now.
Okay. So no public comments. And I just wanted to acknowledge passing of Board of Supervisor Wilma Chan as we close, and with a moment of silence. A great leader, a great example of public service, and just an incredible one. So it's a great loss to the county and to the people of California. With a moment of silence. Thank you so much, and we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Nice seeing you. Bye.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. It's a little fragile. Well, it's weird.